Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over 18 years, and throughout that extensive career in television, he had developed a profound understanding of how competition and pressure could reveal the true nature of relationships. He had witnessed marriages that strengthened under the spotlight of public scrutiny, partners who supported each other through victories and defeats with equal grace, and couples who demonstrated through their interactions what genuine partnership looked like in practice. However, he had also observed marriages where the stress of competition exposed fractures that had been carefully hidden from public view, relationships where the dynamics that might function adequately in private became clearly problematic when subjected to the intensity of game show pressure and public observation. What transpired on that autumn afternoon in September 2024 would demonstrate how a marriage that appeared functional on the surface could reveal itself as fundamentally unequal when tested by competition, and how that revelation could lead one partner towards strength and independence while leaving the other confronting the consequences of years of diminishing behavior. Before examining this significant moment in detail, if you appreciate content that explores the dynamics of unequal partnerships and the journey towards self-respect and independence, please take a moment to engage with this material by liking and subscribing to our channel. We share narratives that examine relationship patterns and remind us that walking away from what diminishes us is sometimes the strongest choice we can make for ourselves and our future. The Caldwell family from Indianapolis, Indiana stood ready to compete against the Reynolds family from Sacramento, California. The Caldwell family consisted of 46-year-old Robert Caldwell, his wife Monica, who was 43, their adult son Tyler, who was 21, Robert's brother Daniel, and Monica's sister Jessica. From the opening moments of their introduction, the production staff noticed dynamics between Robert and Monica that suggested an imbalanced relationship where one partner dominated and the other accommodated with practiced submission. Robert carried himself with aggressive confidence that bordered on arrogance, speaking over other family members and positioning himself as the obvious leader and primary strategist for the team. When Steve asked the family general questions during introductions, Robert answered on behalf of everyone, including Monica, who stood beside him with a smile that appeared practiced rather than genuine. When Steve directed questions specifically to Monica about her work as a physical therapist or her interests outside of family responsibilities, Robert interjected before she could fully respond, either adding commentary that subtly corrected or diminished what she said or redirecting the conversation to topics he preferred to discuss. Monica's sister Jessica watched these interactions with visible tension in her expression, clearly uncomfortable with the way Robert treated her sister, but uncertain whether to intervene in what might be considered private marital dynamics. Tyler, the adult son, seemed resigned to his father's dominating behavior, having apparently grown up with this pattern as normal family functioning. The overall impression created during these opening minutes was of a family organized around accommodating Robert's need for control and centrality, rather than functioning as a unit of equals supporting one another. The game began with these dynamics already established, and the competitive pressure of the game intensified Robert's controlling tendencies rather than moderating them. During the first round, when Monica provided an answer that was not on the board, Robert's response was immediate and harsh. He announced loudly to Steve and the studio audience that he had told Monica what to say, and she had foolishly given a different answer, proving once again that she could not be trusted to make good decisions without his guidance. He said this with a laugh that suggested he meant it as humor, but the underlying contempt and condescension were unmistakable to anyone paying attention to tone and content, rather than just surface delivery. Monica's reaction to Robert's public criticism revealed the depth of her conditioning to accept such treatment. She immediately apologized not just to Robert, but to the entire family, saying she was sorry for letting everyone down, and that she should have listened to Robert's suggestion. Her automatic assumption of fault and her eagerness to deflect blame from Robert onto herself demonstrated patterns consistent with long-term emotional conditioning in an unequal relationship. Jessica, watching her sister apologize for the crime of providing an incorrect answer to a game show question, looked increasingly distressed and angry. The pattern continued and intensified through subsequent rounds. When Monica provided correct answers that appeared on the board, Robert took credit by claiming he had coached her on what to say or by minimizing the value of her contribution, with comments about how obvious the answer had been. When she made strategic decisions about whether to play or pass after winning face-offs, Robert publicly overruled her choices and explained to Steve that Monica lacked the strategic thinking necessary to make such decisions competently. When she celebrated small victories with visible joy, Robert made dismissive comments about her getting too excited over minor accomplishments. Throughout these interactions, Steve's expression grew increasingly serious and concerned. He made several attempts to redirect Robert's behavior through pointed comments about the importance of supporting family members and treating spouses with respect. However, Robert appeared immune to these subtle corrections, either not recognizing that Steve was addressing problematic behavior or not caring about Steve's obvious disapproval. The audience's response to Robert shifted from uncertain laughter at his early comments to visible discomfort and disapproval as the pattern of belittlement became impossible to ignore or excuse as playful teasing. The breaking point occurred during a round where Monica won a face-off and her answer revealed that she had provided the number one response, worth significant points. It was a moment that should have been celebrated as a clear victory and vindication of her instincts. However, Robert's reaction transformed what should have been triumph into another opportunity for diminishment. He announced that Monica had gotten lucky with an obvious answer that anyone could have provided, and that her excitement about this minor success revealed how low her standards were and how little she understood about real achievement. Something shifted in Monica's expression as Robert delivered this assessment of her moment of success. For the first time since the game had begun, she did not immediately smile and accept his characterization of her performance. Instead, she stood very still at the center podium where she had just won the face-off, staring at Robert with an expression that suggested she was seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their marriage, or at least seeing him from outside the fog of accommodation and conditioning that had normalized his treatment of her for so long. When Monica returned to stand with her family after the face-off, she did not position herself next to Robert as she had done throughout the game. Instead, she deliberately stood between her sister Jessica and her son Tyler, creating physical distance from her husband that was subtle but noticeable to anyone observing the family dynamics carefully. When it was her turn to answer subsequent questions, she provided her responses without the apologetic hesitation that had characterized her earlier participation, speaking with growing confidence and clarity that suggested internal change was occurring even as the game continued around her. Robert appeared to sense the shift in Monica's demeanor and responded with escalating attempts to reassert his dominance and control. He became more openly critical of her answers, more dismissive of her contributions, and more insistent on his role as the family's leader and strategist. However, his intensified efforts to diminish Monica seemed to have the opposite effect of what he intended. Rather than returning her to compliant accommodation, his increased aggression appeared to strengthen her resolve and clarify her recognition of how unacceptable his treatment had been throughout their marriage. The game eventually concluded with the Caldwell family winning enough points to advance to fast money, though the competitive success felt almost irrelevant given the relationship dynamics that had been revealed and the transformation that appeared to be occurring in Monica's understanding of her marriage. During the fast money round, Monica played first and provided strong answers that accumulated a respectable point total. When Robert played second and the family's combined score proved sufficient to win the grand prize, the celebration was fractured and uncomfortable rather than unified and joyful. Steve Harvey, who had been watching the deterioration of Robert and Monica's dynamic throughout the episode, made a decision as the game concluded. Rather than simply congratulating the family on their victory and moving immediately to close the show, he asked if he could speak with Robert and Monica for a moment. What he said to them, with cameras still rolling and the studio audience listening, would crystallize everything that had been building throughout the episode and would mark the moment when Monica's internal transformation became external action. Steve addressed Robert directly, telling him that his treatment of Monica throughout the game had been disrespectful, demeaning, and completely unacceptable. He explained that he had hosted thousands of families over his years with the show and had developed a clear sense of what healthy family dynamics looked like versus what patterns suggested deeper problems in relationships. He told Robert that the way he spoke to and about Monica, the credit he took for her successes while blaming her for any perceived failures, and his obvious need to diminish her in order to maintain his own sense of superiority, all indicated a marriage built on inequality and control rather than partnership and mutual respect. Steve then turned to Monica and spoke to her with visible compassion and concern. He told her that watching her apologize repeatedly for things that were not her fault, accept blame for normal game show mistakes, and allow Robert to take credit for her achievements had been painful to witness. He said that her visible joy at winning the face-off followed immediately by Robert's dismissal of that achievement had revealed the dynamic that likely characterized their entire marriage. He asked her directly whether she recognized that the way Robert treated her was not normal or acceptable, and whether she understood that she deserved partnership based on mutual respect rather than a relationship where her role was to accommodate someone who clearly saw her as inferior. Monica stood silently for a long moment, visibly processing Steve's words and the weight of what he was naming so directly. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried unmistakable clarity and strength. She said that she had known for years that something was wrong in her marriage, but had convinced herself that Robert's behavior was just his personality, that accepting his dominance was the price of keeping her family intact, and that her feelings of diminishment and erasure were her own fault for being too sensitive or demanding. She said that watching herself on camera throughout the game, seeing her own apologetic posture and automatic acceptance of blame, had made visible what she had normalized and excused for the entire duration of their 20-year marriage. She told Steve that she did not know what she was going to do with this clarity, but that she could not pretend anymore that Robert's treatment of her was acceptable or that their marriage was healthy just because it was functional. She said that she felt stronger standing there, having named the truth, than she had felt in years of trying to be good enough to earn Robert's respect and approval. She thanked Steve for having the courage to name what he had witnessed rather than ignoring it for the sake of smooth television production. Robert attempted to defend himself and to reframe his behavior as tough love or honest feedback that Monica needed because of her tendency toward emotional thinking and poor judgment. However, his defensive justifications only served to demonstrate exactly what Steve had described: the inability to take responsibility for his impact on Monica, and the reflexive need to blame her for being hurt by his hurtful behavior. Monica listened to Robert's explanations with an expression that suggested she was hearing clearly for the first time how hollow his justifications were and how completely they revealed his lack of genuine respect for her as an equal partner. The episode never aired in its original form. Instead, the network worked with relationship therapists and domestic violence experts who specialized in emotional abuse and coercive control to create a special program that used portions of the footage to educate viewers about the dynamics of unequal partnerships and the patterns of behavior that characterized emotionally abusive relationships, even in the absence of physical violence. The program included expert commentary explaining the specific behaviors Robert had exhibited that constituted emotional abuse, information about resources available to people in similar relationships, and discussion of why leaving such relationships was often difficult despite the obvious harm they caused. The program also documented what happened in the months following the taping. Monica had indeed used the clarity she gained from seeing herself and her marriage from outside her usual perspective as a catalyst for change. She moved out of the home she shared with Robert and filed for legal separation, explaining to him that she would consider reconciliation only if he committed to intensive individual therapy to address his controlling behavior, and they both engaged in marriage counseling focused specifically on creating genuine equality in their relationship. she made clear that she was no longer willing to accept a marriage where her role was to accommodate his need for dominance and superiority. Robert initially responded with anger and accusations that Monica was being manipulated by outside influences and was destroying their family over television drama that had no bearing on their real relationship. However, when faced with the reality that Monica was serious about separation and would not return to the marriage under the old terms, he eventually agreed to begin therapy. Whether he would do the genuine work necessary to change his patterns or would simply learn better ways to disguise them remained uncertain, but Monica emphasized that his choices were his own and that her decision to stay separate was not dependent on his willingness to change, but rather on her own commitment to no longer accepting treatment that diminished her. Monica reported in follow-up interviews that the months of separation had been simultaneously difficult and liberating. She described the challenge of rebuilding her sense of self after years of having her judgment, intelligence, and worth constantly questioned and undermined by the person who should have been her greatest supporter. She also spoke about the relief of making decisions without second-guessing whether they would meet with Robert's approval, of having accomplishments celebrated rather than minimized, and of gradually reclaiming confidence in her own capabilities and worth. She emphasized that what had appeared on Family Feud was not an aberration or Robert behaving unusually poorly under pressure, but rather an amplification of dynamics that had characterized their marriage from its beginning. The game show setting had simply made visible what she had normalized and what their friends and family had either not seen or had chosen not to acknowledge. She said that having Steve name Robert's behavior as unacceptable and having a studio audience visibly uncomfortable with how Robert treated her had broken through her isolation and her belief that she was wrong to be hurt by treatment that was actually harmful. The special program that aired in place of the original episode generated significant response from viewers. Thousands of people reached out to share that they had recognized their own relationships in the dynamics between Robert and Monica, that they had been living with similar patterns of diminishment and control, and that seeing the situation presented clearly as unhealthy rather than normal had helped them recognize that their own experiences warranted concern and potential intervention. Many specifically referenced Monica's visible transformation from apologetic accommodation to clear-eyed recognition of unacceptable treatment as inspiring them to examine their own relationships with new perspective. Relationship therapists and domestic violence advocates praised the program for illustrating that emotional abuse existed on a spectrum and that relationships did not need to involve physical violence or obvious cruelty to be harmful and warrant leaving. They emphasized that patterns like those Robert exhibited, where one partner consistently took credit for successes while blaming the other for failures, where accomplishments were minimized and mistakes were magnified, and where one person's judgment was constantly questioned and undermined, created psychological damage that could be as profound as physical harm. Steve Harvey spoke about the experience in subsequent interviews as one of the most important interventions of his career. He explained that he had witnessed concerning dynamics between spouses during other tapings, but had not always felt empowered to address them directly. However, watching Robert systematically diminish Monica while she automatically accepted blame and apologized for normal human limitations had moved him to act despite the risk that his intervention might be seen as overstepping boundaries or imposing his values on others' private relationships. He emphasized that what he had witnessed was not a matter of different relationship styles or personal preferences, but rather a clear pattern of one person maintaining power and control by undermining another person's confidence and autonomy. He said that Monica's visible strength as she recognized and named what had been done to her had demonstrated that people in such relationships often knew on some level that the treatment was wrong, but needed external validation and support to trust their own perceptions and to believe that they deserved better. Several years after the episode, Monica had finalized her divorce from Robert after attempts at reconciliation had revealed that his patterns were too deeply entrenched to change substantially despite therapy. She had rebuilt her life with independence and confidence, had advanced professionally in ways that had not been possible when she was managing Robert's reactions to her successes, and had developed friendships and connections that nourished rather than depleted her. She spoke publicly about her journey as a way of helping others recognize similar patterns in their own relationships and encouraging them to prioritize their own well-being and dignity over the comfort of familiar dysfunction. The story of the marriage tested on stage, where only one spouse walked away stronger, became a cultural reference point in discussions about emotional abuse, unequal partnerships, and the courage required to leave relationships that diminish rather than support personal growth and well-being. The contrast between Monica's apologetic submission at the beginning of the game and her clear-eyed strength by its conclusion provided a powerful visual representation of how quickly clarity could emerge when patterns were made visible and named accurately. If this examination of unequal relationships and the journey towards strength and independence has provided meaningful perspective, please support our channel by engaging with this content through likes and subscriptions. Share this story with others who might benefit from examining whether their own relationships are characterized by mutual respect and support or by patterns of diminishment and control. In partnerships built on genuine equality, both people celebrate each other's successes rather than competing for superiority. Both people take responsibility for their own behavior rather than blaming partners for being hurt by hurtful actions, and both people emerge stronger through their connection rather than one person growing while the other shrinks to accommodate. Monica's transformation from accommodation to clarity remains a testament to the strength that can emerge when we finally see our circumstances truthfully and choose to walk toward dignity, even when that path requires leaving behind what is familiar but harmful.